the new BlenderDiplom 3D TV. Glasses not included. Before we begin modeling the Pintoy, I'd like to show you just a little bit about the theory of Dupliverts. What Dupliverts do is they take the vertices of a given object and place another object just where they are. So if I were to take a plane and enable the Dupliverts option right here, that wouldn't do much because it needs a child object. So if I take the default cube and parent it to the plane by pressing Ctrl P, the cube will now be duplicated at each vertex. So of course, if I were to subdivide this, there would be more copies of cubes. So what I'm going to do is subdivide this and increase the number of cuts quite a bit, let's say 5. And now if I scale down the cube, you can see they are all in a row. So duplicating this cube a couple of times is not very special on its own, but let's have a look at what we can do with this. For example, we can add a displace modifier. And if I choose a texture here, this is just some clouds texture I created, then the cube will be displaced. And right now, this is not very special. So I'm going to subdivide this again. But as you can imagine, we can do certain things with it. For example, we can have this react to music and thereby having a lot of dancing objects. We can also use dynamic paint in order to make those objects move. It's just a matter of exchanging a two-dimensional surface by a bunch of three-dimensional objects. And let's have a look at what we can do with this effect. We'll hit Shift-D, duplicate this, and move it to another layer. Now I'm going to delete the displacement modifier, and let's press Shift-C, add a mesh and a UV sphere this time, and I'm just going to lower the segments to 16 and the rings to 8, and let's just select all the lower vertices and delete them. Alt click on this, alt right click of course, on this loop, press E to extrude, and then push this down. Okay, now we have a pin. Shift-Z will make this pin smaller, but you can see it also makes it more pointy. I don't want this to be pointy. I want this to be non-pointy, round or blunt. So press period and enable this connected editing mode. That also can be done by pressing the letter O, press S and Z, and you can see that there are circle forms around your mouse. It will influence everything inside that circle. And if I am moving the mouse inwards now, you can see our pin gets rounded again. I'll press smooth over here and scale it down, and then shift click on the plane and press Ctrl P to parent. And now you can see our pin is getting duplicated, which is no surprise because the Dupliverts options are still intact. By now you can probably guess this is supposed to be a Pintoy, but you can see we have a problem. It's fine for the cubes that we have squares here actually, but with the rounded objects I don't want them to look like that anymore. I actually want them to look like this. Disable connected editing, GY, and move it over here. This is actually the way I want them to look like. So what can we do? We could of course do the same thing I just did to every other line by selecting them, and so on. But as I've mentioned before, this tutorial is about methods and not about clicking around until you are happy. So A, B, and delete everything except this, X vertices. And now you can see that I also moved this middle one here in X direction, so this is out of sync. I could of course now move this until it approximately fits, but since we're duplicating this a couple of times, I need this to be exact. So I'm going to delete these, alt click on this edge loop, and press Shift S and cursor to selected. So my cursor is exactly in the middle between those and also exactly on top of this edge. Now I'll click on this loop and make sure you're still at pivot point 3D cursor. Press Shift D to duplicate the entire edge, and press S, X, and -1, and this will mirror the entire plane or the entire loop here, and place it with the same distance to this on the other side of this edge. Now if we shift select these, we can press W, Loop Tools, Bridge. And if you don't see the loop tools enabled, you need to enable them. Press Ctrl Alt U, go to Add-ons, and type in Loop, and this will enable your mesh loop tools. Okay, so now we have the basic structure of our pincushion. This looks quite right. Let's scale the pincushion up a bit, but press comma so it's now to its original center again, and you can see this looks like a decent pincushion. You could fiddle with the size a little if you want to, like so, but this is not going to do much. So if you want to change the size, I'll show you how to do this later on. But first let's add a modifier, and that is an array modifier. An array, of course, makes copies of your object and places them in 3D space the way you define over here. A relative offset of 1 will take the bounding box of this and move the next copy exactly one size of your original object in X direction. And of course we want more copies, so just click count until you're happy. And before, you can see that the displacement modifier was calculated before the duplication took place. But those modifiers that actually generate vertices are not taken into account. The ones that displace vertices and change their location, those are being accounted for before the Dupliverts take place. So with this modifier, we'd actually have to click apply, but before I do this, let's duplicate this and move it to a garbage layer. Now if I press apply, those vertices are real and they actually are being used for the Duplivert. Now this is something we don't have to do, but I'd still like to show you because I think it's a neat method and you can use this for a lot of other things. If we were to say, okay, this is not big enough for me, but I've already applied the array modifier, it's of course no problem to make this broader because there is a straight edge. But what if we want to change the height of this? For this, I'd select this vertex, press Shift S, cursor to select it. And you can see I use the pivot point of the cursor a lot because I think it's a really neat idea, and if you think about it just for a second, it saves you a lot of positioning time. Now let's press Shift D and immediately right click, press R and 180, and you can see we've duplicated the size of our pincushion. And right now there are some gaps here. They don't matter because the plane doesn't get rendered anyways. But if you are nervous about the gaps, you can go back into edit mode and you can press comma to have the pivot point the center of the selection again. Press S, Y, and -1. And this will mirror your entire selection. And you can see now the gap is actually visible. But if you go to this option here and select vertex, your snapping will be to the nearest vertex. If you press G and Y now, you can move this along the Y axis, no snapping enabled. But if you hold Control, you can see that your entire selection snaps to this vertex over here. And since those vertices are double now, let's press W and remove doubles. You can see just quite a few of them got deleted, and now my viewport is not lagging anymore. So apparently I accidentally produced a couple of doubles. And you can see now I have a pretty big pincushion, or Pintoy. Okay, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to actually make this smaller again because we don't need this many. We don't need to stress my poor computer too much because for demonstration purposes this is fine. And you can see now the pins are evenly distributed and the space between two pins is actually quite nice. But this is not an entire pincushion. So let's have a look at how to complete the rendering. Let's move to a different layer for this for a second and create a plane. I'm going to insert two loop cuts, one here, and you can right click after clicking, which places the loop cuts exactly in between those two, and do the same thing here. Insert a loop cut, Ctrl R, and then immediately right click. Now I'm going to delete all these vertices, and I'm going to add a mirror modifier. And I want to mirror this in X and also in Y. So we basically have the same thing as before, but we only need to modify one corner because I want rounded corners on this. Press Ctrl 2, and this, you can see, adds a subsurf modifier. And if I now press Ctrl R and push this up, press Ctrl R again and push this to the side, you can see that we have a rectangle with rounded corners. And if I now scale this, you can see that the rounded corners get destroyed. So what I'm going to do is take these vertices, B to box select, and move them over here. And you can see the rounding of the corner is now being the same as before. And I can do the same thing with these. But before I do that, let's have a look at our original pincushion. Let's rotate this one. Let's rotate this 90 degrees, and I can of course scale this up if I don't restrict it to an axis. So let's put this in the middle of this and scale this up some more, and this actually looks pretty neat already. So we don't have to, actually we should go in and repeat this trick over here like so, and there we have the basis for our pincushion. I'm not going to worry about the scale right now. We're going to scale this later on. And I want the space in between those two to be evenly distributed. So that looks about right. Okay, so there's going to be the center, and I'm going to add another modifier, and this is the solidify modifier. Solidify takes your mesh or your plane and makes it thicker. So you can increase the thinness of this, or the thickness I should say, and now we have a ground plate. And let's duplicate this plate and move it up here, and this will be the glass or plexiglass plate on top of this. And I'm also going to need one pin. So these two are on layer 3, so let's click 3 to get to layer 3, and let's just hide these and create a cylinder. Let's create a cylinder of 6 vertices and have a look at this from the front. S, Shift Z will make it smaller, and let's go into vertex select. If you don't know how to change this mode, I'm always doing this without thinking, you can either click on these symbols, this is edge select, face select, or you can press Ctrl Tab and go into a vertex select mode. And now let's extrude those. Just scale this out. Extrude again. Push this up a little. Extrude again. Push this in. And let's make this roughly the same as this, or actually let's make it exactly the same by holding Ctrl and hovering over one of these vertices. So now it has the same diameter as the original cylinder. E again. Push this up. And E once more, right click and Alt M at center, and press Ctrl 1, and we have a subdivision surface modifier on top of it, and we can see that this has too much rounded edge for my taste over here. So Alt right click on this edge and increase the mean crease, and this will just flatten this out. And this is exactly what I want. Let's increase the flattening of this as well, but not as much. And of course you can achieve the same effect by using another loop cut and pushing it towards the center, or this other vertex. But this creates another loop cut. Of course we want to keep it as low poly as possible. Let's all click on this one and also increase the mean crease until it is something like this. And we can use this as a bolt. Okay, unhide everything. Let's have a look at this. It's too short, and also I don't need this vertex. Okay, now S, Z, and move this until this hits the surface. And let's call this the glass plate. Let's call this the bottom plate. And I do not like spaces. That's just a quirk of mine, because when I started using computers there were no spaces allowed, and also on the internet this may give you some trouble. So let's grab this one and move it over here, and let's add a mirror modifier. Take this plane and press Shift S, cursor to selected. Take this one, Control Shift and Alt C, and select Origin to 3D Cursor. And you can see the mirror modifier is actually mirroring at the center. So if you press mirror in X direction, this will create a hypothetical mirroring axis along the Y axis, and its location will be determined by the center. And let's do the same thing along the Y axis, and we probably need 2 more of these. So let's duplicate this one, duplicate, Shift-D, move it all the way down here, and let's only take the ones we need. Press R and 90, and now delete those vertices. And the reason why this is not looking very nice is the subsurf modifier is applied first, and then the mirror modifier is applied. And this is never a good idea, because the subsurf modifier moves vertices and it can move them away from the center. So move the mirror on top, and still it looks weird, and the reason is the merge limit. If those two are not merged, then the subsurf modifier will see this as a straight edge. And apparently they are not close enough together. So you can enable clipping and move this down just a little bit, and you can see now that this is working, because now those two are merged and the subsurf modifier is acting on an entire circle. Now let's have a look at the materials. I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-U, and that will get me to the user preferences. And if you type in import here, you can see import images as planes. So check this, close it, and then go to File, Import, and choose Images as Planes. And then choose whatever JPEG you want. I'm going to use the wood JPEG. And the good thing about this is it imports a plane with the same dimensions of your JPEG, and it already unwraps it, and of course also the JPEG is included. So if I press Tab here, you can see this is already perfectly unwrapped with the right coordinates, with the right scale, and so on. So perfect. If you were on Blender Internal, this would already have the material and the texture assigned to it. So very handy plugin, saves you a lot of work. And let's have a look at how to convert this to cycles. I'm going to check Use Nodes here, and then I'm going to press Shift-A, Texture, Image, Texture, and now choose the wood JPEG. Connect the color to the color, and then connect the color to the displacement as well, but the displacement of 1 in this case, I guess. Unconverted displacement is way too much, so converter, add a math node, set this to multiply, and then set this to a really low value, like 0.01, maybe even 0.001. I like to get the main part, the part that I can already tell it's going to be important. I like to get that out of the way before I start the test rendering, because also my graphics card tends to get very, very loud if I use it too much. So let's have a look at this glass material. So we could use a simple glass material. I mean, there is a preset. If we just click on this and choose glass, that would be fairly easy. Thing is, glass in cycles renders pretty slow. And since we don't have any IOR, because this is supposed to be plexiglass, we won't see any IOR. So we can use something that is comparable to the Z transparency in Blender Internal Renderer, which is just a transparent BSDF. And the transparency of this material is determined by the color. We'll check that as soon as we start rendering. Let me just insert another texture here, Shift-A, Texture, Image, Texture, and then choose the smudge JPEG. And then use a converter math node again. Connect this, put the math node in between, set it to multiple, and set this to a low value.
we'll have to figure out the exact details later on. Now these stumps here, I gave some rough metal in Blender. So let's convert this to Cycles rough metal. I'll just use glossy and put the roughness to something like 0.1 and decrease the brightness of the color. In glossy materials, the roughness, of course, determines how sharp your reflections are, meaning they get blurred. The more roughness, the more they will get blurred. And the brightness of the color means how much the original color will poke through. So how much the original color will influence the color of your reflections. So perfect white and roughness of 0 would be a perfect mirror material. I'm going to hide this, and while this is selected, I'll press Y, and then you can see the pin here is very visible, so that's no problem at all. I already called this material pins in Blender Internal, and I'm going to use a slightly brighter and also glossy material. So fairly bright, roughness very low, and leave it at that. This is supposed to be just a plastic material, so I'm not sure if the roughness of a diffuse material does anything. Just set this to a very dark material and not make it black. Now let's press Alt H, so we have our stuff back, and let's check rendered mode. And you can see this is very slow, so if it's not already checked, choose GPU, and this is going to be a lot quicker. You can see this is sort of starting to work, but apparently the multiply does not agree with the transparent material input. So let's just disconnect this for now. You can see it is slightly not white, and if I put this down, the transparency decreases. So we're going to sort of fake the glass material, because it renders a lot faster if we do it this way. So select, keep this selected, and go to the modifier settings, and in the solidify choose rim +1, and that means the rim color will now be a different one than the glass. You can already see this, I guess. Not really. Let's just add another material, and this is what the +1 refers to. If I now add another material, you can see the rim has this second material. So I'm going to use another transparent material, but of course we're not going to make this green. Just the transparency should be less than the transparency of the plate. And this is because of the Fresnel effect. If you have light passing through a glass plate, and those two faces here are orthogonal, they have a right angle to each other, they will reflect and let light pass through in a different way, resulting in the rim having another color. And this is actually pretty dark, so I'm going to add another shader, just a diffuse one, and also add another shader, mix shader. And as I said, we're faking this, so it's no problem using two shaders that probably should not be combined usually. If you have the time and render power, just go ahead and use a glass material and you're fine. Now this is looking pretty good already. Let's just insert a mesh light. And I'm just going to add a plane and set the material to emission. And for some reason I don't see much of a difference if we get closer. If you want to make sure there is a difference, just go ahead and choose green as a color, and let's have a look at the world settings. There's a new button, ambient occlusion, and no matter what you have set here, if you have the ambient occlusion on, it has the same meaning as the add ambient occlusion in Blender Internal. So I'm going to turn this off because I like having a lot of control over my scene. So I'm going to use the sun. Let's do slightly red, slightly yellowy red, and for the plane I'm going to use a very slight blue color and also increase the strength of this. Not quite that much, 20, Okay, this looks pretty metally, which is exactly what I wanted. And let's have a look at the glass plate, because this plate in my eyes is too perfect. So we're going to use this much texture. So let's go back to the glass material, and we're going to use another material, shader glossy, because this is supposed to be slightly glossy, slightly reflective, and we're going to mix the two together by a mix shader. If we do that, you can see this is basically half transparent, half glossy. And I'm going to lower the factor, and you can see that the transparency pokes through a lot more. Already looks pretty nice, but way too even. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using this as an input for the transparency, I'm going to use it as a factor. And if I set this to 1 again, you should see a difference. Let me increase the samples here so we can make sure that the difference is not just grain. And you can see there is some glossiness, but it's way too much, so I'm just going to lower this again to 0.2. You can of course toy around with those settings. You can use any texture you like. Just remember not to make this too perfect, because it will make your image seem very fake. Now let's have a look at the camera settings. You can see this little yellow cross here. I have already enabled limits, so if you don't see the yellow cross, check limits, and then use the distance slider over here in order to move the yellow cross right onto your object, because this is the focal point of the camera. And if I now increase the radius of the aperture, you can see that we're getting some depth of field. I can make this effect very drastic, and so you can see it. The foreground here and the background start to get very blurred. So 0.04 is already quite a lot. I'm also going to lower the distance, and now we have our depth of field. And should you decide your pins are too coarse, you can go in and just press W and subdivide. Of course, now our pins are way too thick, but that doesn't matter. You can just take the pin here, this one, and scale it down until you have the pin size that you like. I'd say this is a decent pin. Thing is, now the pins are too short, and if I scale this only in Z, we have the same problem as we had in the modeling. Actually, if you prefer pins that are this sharp, that is no problem for you at all. So actually this wouldn't be the worst thing. But if you want to make the pins longer, you just go into edit mode of the original pin and just push the lowest vertices down. Now we have those pins, and as a matter of fact, I might have been a little unspecific about the anatomy of a Pintoy. Those should poke through the bottom plane. So the bottom plane should be a little higher, and this should be a little lower, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to push the poor pins with your hands. So that should be a little more realistic. So now all you need to do is choose a nice pattern for your pins. And what I did was I took a picture of my hand and used GIMP to modify it so I could use it as a black and white map for my input. So unfortunately for this, you have to switch back to Blender Render and go to the dummy material, because otherwise you won't be able to change the Blender internal textures, and you have to use Blender internal textures for the displacement modifier. So all I did was took a picture of my hand, made it black and white, and then imported it as a texture. Check this and switch back to cycles. Go into the modifier settings and use hand JPEG. And if I switch on back the eye of the modifier, you can see my hand poking through. Another thing about the input is you can of course UV unwrap this and then use the right dimensions of your displacement image or movie, but this is something I don't really do. What I like to do is I use an input object, and if you have a look here, you can see that I have an empty here, And if I move this empty, the hand moves with it. So this sort of gives you a live control over your displacement, because for example, if you UV unwrap this and you wanted to change this just a little bit, once you enter edit mode, your displacement modifier is no longer visible. You can actually make this visible like so, even in edit mode, but this is something I don't really want. What I usually do is I use an empty, and you can see this empty here. If I hide this empty controls where the hand is. And that is actually fairly simple to set up. All you need to do is insert an empty, give it a name, hand offset. You can change the name down here, and then you choose your modifier. In this case, it's the plane and the displace modifier, and instead of texture coordinates UV, you choose object. And for UV, of course, you need to UV unwrap this. For object, you need an object. Global means it is relative to the global XYZ, and local means it is basically the same thing as the generated coordinates in the render settings do. So once you set this to object, you can use the empty in order to control your image. So the empty will give you full control over how your hand is displaced, or whatever image you're using is displayed on your pins. And another cute opportunity that sort of arises is if you were to rotate the Pintoy without rotating the empty, the image would stay in place. And this is probably not something you'll use excessively, but still it's a nice effect. If you don't want that, all you need to do is parent the empty to your plane. And I'm sorry, but this is actually pretty funny. This is not a malfunction of a displace modifier. This is actually a ton of empties getting duplicated, because now we have an empty at each vertex, because of course the plane is dupliverting the empty as well, because it's parented to the plane as well. So what you can see here is actually a couple of thousand empties being displayed. So scratch that. Don't parent the empty to the plane. You can work around that by either parenting the plane to the empty, or you can use another master empty to parent both of them. So if you want to rotate both of them, just use that one. So actually don't parent the empty to the plane. And of course you can use all sorts of textures, and what is the coolest, you can use animated textures. And for the preview I have used After Effects. I can make a short tutorial on how to link sound to things in After Effects. But for example, you can use dynamic paint, you can use some weird animation that you render in black and white, you can use a Z depth of an animation. That would be actually the perfect thing to do. And I guess let me just show you how this is done. I could use a new scene, but that would just make things messy. So what I'm going to do is use an entirely different file. So let's say we want this react to music. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put this cube down, and I'm just going to press Shift C and then period and then SZ and 0. So it's perfectly leveled to the Z0. And then I'm going to push this down, and I'm going to use an array modifier and offset this in Z position. And I'm going to increase the count and also the Z position offset just a little bit. And now I'm going to use a bevel modifier. And bevel is a modifier that I only recommend if you don't use any UV unwrapped textures. I'm going to lower the ankle quite a bit actually. And if I now were to animate the count, we'd have somewhat of an equalizer. Okay, so I'm going to make this smaller. Let's say we make a couple of animations, and we'll also use a couple of objects like the monkey, and we'll just distribute them in space. And a cone, I guess. Okay, all they need to have is different offsets. So you can create an entire animation of these objects jumping around, or whatever you want to jump around. Then you're going to go to the layer options in the render settings and choose mist. Okay, now press Ctrl left arrow and check use nodes, and you can see the mist pass here. I'm going to connect the mist pass to the output, and let's render this. After it's done rendering, you can see everything is black and white. Problem is, every object is white, and we want to distinguish how far the objects are away from the camera. So I'm going to go into the world options with the camera selected and choose mist. But unfortunately we don't see the mist, so go back into the camera options and enable the mist display. So go to the world options and now increase the starting point. You can see this little dot here is where the mist starts, and the other one is where the mist ends. So everything past this point will be absolutely black, and everything in front of this point will be absolutely white. So it's usually a good idea to use the entire range. So to have nothing that is entirely white and nothing that is entirely black. So make the range as close as possible, because then you can go in and have curves or whatever other node you want to modify your mist, or I should say in this case your depth map. And you can see this is working, but not very significantly. So I'm just going to push these objects back a lot more. Otherwise, this is something you can experiment with. You can set this to linear, for example. Quadratic means the density of the mist will become thicker the further you are away from that point. So instead of being a linear fall off, the intensity difference between this point and this point is a lot less than between this point and this point, and of course even more so between this point and this point. So it's about the interpolation. If I render this again, you can see that the cone has a different color and the monkey ear has a different color too. Set this to linear, and you can see the effect is more drastic. And I actually, for the depth map, I would recommend linear because it's just more realistic. And if you use this as a displacement, you would of course have the white parts stick out more and the gray parts be more pushed back. So you can animate any scene in Blender, render it as a depth map, and you will have it displayed on your Pintoy in the correct order, or actually even in the correct depth. And in the next part we'll show you how to use drivers in order to visualize music in Blender. And of course you can combine that with the Pintoy. Until then,